Welcome to our 44th Lutyens Trust America webinar. I'm Robin Prater, the Executive Director of LTA. Today I'm joined by Marcos Lutyens, our chair, and our panelists Swapna Liddle and Ankie Barnes. Today we'll be discussing the Indo-Saracenic movement and how Edwin Lutyens' architectural work in India reacted to that architecture. Swapna Liddle is an author and historian with a specialization in the history of Delhi. Her interest in Delhi began with an examination of cultural change under early colonial rule, the subject of a PhD thesis. More recently, she's been taking a longer view of the city, looking at a range of questions, such as the development of an aura of imperial power and city planning in the context of specific polities such as the Mughal and the colonial, and the evolution of spaces in the context of multiple identities. Many of these questions also closely impinge on present-day concerns about heritage, its definition, ownership, and management, issues that Swapna is interested in. She's been raising awareness about the need to preserve the diverse heritage of Delhi among stakeholders and the general public over the last 2 decades. Swapna is the author of a number of books, including Connaught Place and The Making of New Delhi, Chandni Chowk, The Mughal City of Old Delhi, and Delhi 14 Historic Walks. Swapna's worked with us on 2 previous webinars for LTA, so we'd met through the magic of Zoom. This past November, I was able to meet Swapna in person during a trip to India, and we began discussing some of the ideas behind this webinar. Our other panelist, Anthony, otherwise known as Ankie Barnes, has great appreciation of India and has traveled there extensively. A native of Johannesburg, South Africa, Ankie received his education at the University of Witwatersrand and Yale University. In between his studies, he traveled extensively and gained professional experience working in London, Cape Town, and Guatemala. Being trained in both traditional and modern architecture, his experience while at Hartman Cox Architects in the 1980s, where he met Steve Vance, was impactful, with opportunities to design contextual, institutional, educational, and civic projects against a stylistic spectrum. Particular emphasis in the classical and traditional realm later became the philosophical design basis of BVA's well-known residential work. Since establishing Barnes Vance Architects in 1989, Ankie and Steve have grown the practice to realize a range of constructed projects every year. Ankie's design agility and passion for merging traditional design with advanced technologies is widely recognized. Before we begin, let me remind you to place any questions or comments you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and placed on our website and YouTube channel. And thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to turn over to Swapna and to begin.
Thank you so much, Robin, and our other host, Marcos. It's always a pleasure to come back to the Lutyens Trust America and talk about Lutyens, and particularly Lutyens' work on Delhi. And I've been a part of a couple of other, as Robin, you mentioned, I have been a part of two other webinars where we've spoken about Lutyens and different aspects of his work. And I come from a position of being a historian. I'm not even an art historian. I'm a garden variety historian. So I always step on this place with a bit of trepidation. I have greater confidence today because I have Ankie, who will be, helping me grapple with some of the subject matter that we are talking about today. But I think this is something that is interesting to me because, particularly in India, we have quite a bit of there's confusion about where to place Lutyens in a historical tradition, and he is often placed at pretty much the architecture of New Delhi generally, which includes both Lutyens and Baker. I'm not talking about the sort of neoclassical stuff that was done by the public works department, but the public buildings designed by Lutyens and Baker tend to be put into a sort of Indo-Saracenic category. And as we were just discussing, even if you open up the Wikipedia page and look at Indo-Saracenic architecture, you will see this here. But I think I'm going to go into what exactly the relationship is and a little bit of the historical context there. When Lutyens and Baker were engaged to do the public buildings, the important public buildings in the New Delhi project, the new capital that was being designed, one person who was attached to that team was Swinton Jacob. Swinton Jacob had already retired from a long practice in India, where he was the proponent of a very important movement, which is known as the Indo-Saracenic. Now, a little bit of, I will go on and talk about what the Indo-Saracenic was, but Lutyens was had a very difficult relationship with Swinton Jacob, and Swinton Jacob, in fact, exited that team very quickly. But the problem that Lutyens had with Swinton Jacob is kind of summed up in this letter that I have quoted. And he says that Swinton Jacob had made this suggestion, which Lutyens didn't think much of, that Lutyens and Baker could design their buildings in the normal sort of way, whatever that meant, and this could be handed over to Indian. Well, they were not even they were not architects, but maybe the kind of people who kind of assisted Swinton Jacob in his practice, and they said that they could tack on Indo-Saracenic elevations. And Lutyens, of course, felt that that was a very the wrong way to deal with this kind of thing. So this is what this is where Lutyens saw himself. He saw himself in opposition to the Indo-Saracenic movement. So I think I can go on now and look at what briefly a little bit about what Indo-Saracenic was about. And if we could go on to the next slide. This was a movement, and we must make that distinction because Indo-Saracenic is an older term which was initially used by colonial historians to characterize the culture, architecture, etc. of India's earlier dynasties, the Mughals, the several dynasties who made up the Delhi Sultanate, to suggest that this was in some senses an Indo-Muslim style, hence Indo-Saracenic. When we talk about the Indo-Saracenic movement in architecture today, we do not refer to that. What we are referring to is this very specific movement that began. So architectural historians today, what they say Indo-Saracenic, what they mean is something that began in the 1860s. And this was it's traditionally the starting point is seen in the work of somebody like Robert Chisholm. And Robert Chisholm, who was, in those days, the difference between architects and engineers and people did all sorts of things. But anyway, he had won architectural competition and had moved to South India, Madras, which we call Chennai today. And he began this trend of designing buildings which were very much modern buildings based on modern principles of structural engineering, modern materials, and of course the functions of those buildings that were all these were very much modern buildings, but in their external or at the level of ornament and important external visible motifs, they incorporated what was sometimes called Indo-Saracenic, but very loosely it was not just the architecture of developed under the Mughals or the Sultanate, but a wide range of different kind of styles. And this is, I think, probably one of the earliest buildings designed by Robert Chisholm in this style. This was it was an old palace complex within which he designed this tower. And maybe this might be a nice time to bring in Ankie, who might have some comments on this tower. What do you think of this?
Well, thank you, Swapna. I'll just say, interestingly enough, the Indo-Saracen movement overlapped quite strongly with the Victorian movement, which really started more like 1839 and went through to the early 1900s. So a lot of these architects were practicing in the Victorian idiom, which was one that often followed, irregular compositions, welcomed the use of ornament and color and so on. And so I think they would have thought that the adding of Indian motifs was just a welcome and interesting international flavor to something that they thought was perfect. And so I think this building is an example. I mean, from the Indian buildings that I've seen, this looks a little bit like a temple or a tomb that's dropped on top of a tower of sort of uncertain scale. I do think particularly the horizontal window quite near the top below the parapet is an unfortunate, probably practical inclusion. So I think it shows that they were grappling with both composition as well as how to incorporate Indian elements, and also struggling with scale. I think the other four little towers, they're not low like Chhatri, they're not as tall as minarets, and yet they're too close to the dome. And from my eye, the dome could have been bigger for a building this tall. So there are many uncertainties that I think come with the early grappling of the combination of these two movements.
And the polychromy on the building, using the colors out of the materials, is very much Victorian as well as something you'd find in India.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. So thank you for that. And Chisholm, as I said, it didn't only mean that you were looking at Mughal styles. And of course, that far south in India, there were other styles that were available. And if you look at the next picture that we have coming up, there Chisholm actually used for a museum in Trivandrum in Kerala. He used a style that was more typical of that part of the country, and this was this was a princely state at that time, and this was the state of Travancore. And he used different styles. So again, just to underline the fact that when we use Indo-Saracenic, we don't just mean an Indian what is meant as an Indian Islamic style. Those are all categories that are problematic in themselves, but we mean this kind of blending of styles that come from various Indian traditions onto grafting them onto, or with good or better or worse success, onto modern buildings. Another example that we have, if you can look at the next building coming up, you have, for instance, the Madras High Court. And there were two people. It was, I think, begun by Brassington and then finished by Irvin, who saw the end through, but I think the design can be attributed to Brassington. And this kind of building, and with the very prominent bulbous domes, different. It's a modification of what you would in Indian buildings refer to as chhatris, little cupolas. But I can talk about the chhatris. I think we can look at the next slide, the next building, and maybe analyze that in a little greater detail to talk about what are the different kind of elements that we see in typical sort of Indo-Saracenic architecture, at least the most popular varieties that were used. So if we could have, yeah, there we are. So one of the things that we had here, this is Mayo College in Ajmer. This is in North India, in In fact, in Rajasthan or Rajputana, which was actually a place, though Ajmer was British, it was in the midst of what were a large number of so-called princely states. These were semi-independent states which were under British suzerainty, but were independent in their internal affairs, more or less. And they were all, these princes were Rajputs. And they had a traditional architecture of their own, which was a blend of different kinds of styles, heavily influenced by Mughal architecture. But again, Mughal architecture itself is an amalgam of different kinds of influences, obviously. So if you try to break down some of this, I'll just talk about some of these features, and then maybe Ankie can take over and talk about what he takes away from this. What you have here is where you see that red highlighted in this picture. You see the cusped arch. This was very typically Mughal, particularly from the time of Shah Jahan, from the mid 17th century onwards. This becomes very, very popular. If you move on, look at other elements that are there, you can see little what we call chhatris. Chhatris are literally the word chhatri means umbrella. It's chhatri, chhata comes from that also. Chhatri is an umbrella. So these are little cupolas. This it's a little small, these chhatris, but they are typically late Mughal in style because they have those curved chhajjas, the curved eaves there, which are very, very typical of late Mughal and very popular. This style was actually very popular in Rajasthan. You could see a lot of that. And then finally, you have chhatris of a different style. And here you have a tapered, what we call a shikhar, which is like it's like a spire, often typically found on tops of temples, and it's in that style. So it's kind of an interesting mix of things. But and of course there is the tower there, and Ankie will definitely talk a little bit more about that. But these were many of these buildings. In fact, you will see these clock towers because this was a very important part of the Indo-Saracenic buildings. Many of these were public buildings, whether they were colleges or museums and things like that. And the idea that you needed to, this was colonial discipline that was being imposed on the colony, and Indians needed to conform to principles of timekeeping, and therefore putting up clock towers was an important part of the brief that these kind of architects were given. But please go ahead, Ankie. What is your comment on this?
Thank you, Swapna. Robin, I'll ask you to go back to the last two slides as well. I just have a couple of comments about the previous two examples. If you go back to the one in Kerala, one more, if you would. But what's interesting here is I think one has to applaud Chisholm for using more of a vernacular roof and language. You know, the sort of Mughal influence was not as strongly felt in the south of India, and so a lot of the architecture here does react more to climate. It's very rainy. It's got these big roofs, which are not atypical, and funnily enough, they're also slightly reminiscent of the stave churches in Norway, which I'm sure that Chisholm would have been familiar with, and I don't know if that got into his hand a little bit. But do notice the little tower, which is thrown in, I think, just for a good Victorian recipe, just to throw a tower in. It's not particularly tall, doesn't seem to do much to the composition to me. But once again, it's an irregular composition, which I think is quite interesting, of course, classically Victorian. It does look as if one was on axis to the left, that the building might be largely symmetrical with the exception of the tower. So it shows that he's got a foot in both camps of composition. If you go to the next slide of the Madras High Court, once again, as Swapna said, one of the things the English were grappling with is how to clothed large civic buildings, which were really relatively new program elements in India. And of course, turning to the classic traditional Indian architecture of large buildings, which would have been temples and palaces, would sort of be a natural move and seem appropriate. But once again, I think there are challenges of scale and composition, as Swapna says, these smaller towers with the domes of two different heights. Are they overgrown chhatri or are they small towers? The big tower at the back, all the way at the back, would be very unusual to find in a temple complex in India. I think maybe with the exception of the Taj Mahal. I mean, most of the temples or tombs would often have been in the center of an idealized garden. So there is a courtyard, which is nice. It's kind of an actual composition from the left, but the tower from an Indian point of view is certainly placed in a funny place. And I think the details are a little bit confused or still searching for, a happy place to be. And then if you go back to the Mayo College that you looked at earlier, once again, this is an almost symmetrical photograph, which is great to see. You can see that the composition is really more of a Neo-Palladian or Beaux-Arts kind of 5-part building with a centerpiece with a main entrance, 2 connectors, and then 2 wings or pavilions on either side. And the scale of those, I think, is not bad in this particular case, although there are a few too many chhatris for my taste. But then just for Victorian effect, off-center at the back right corner, they put that large clock tower with that penetrated dome on top of it. So they're clearly struggling with the genre at the time. I do applaud the fact that this looks like it's all made of solid stone, which is one of the reasons so many of the really fine old Indian examples last so well, is that they were generally built of solid masonry and last perfectly. So those are my thoughts on these. Thank you.
Right. So yes. So Swinton Jacob, of course, he designed a lot of the late 19th century civic buildings, palaces, etc. In Rajasthan, and particularly in Jaipur. He was quite active in Jaipur. This is the Albert Hall Museum, which still is an important museum in Jaipur. It's interesting because this, from at least a lot of it, you can see the open pavilion style, which was it's much more traditional in that sense with what in actual Indian architecture was, the open arcades here that you can see. The chhatris, the very typical, very late Mughal, also popular in Rajasthan kind of chhatri that you can see over here. Do you have any comment on this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Swapna. Yeah, one thing interesting about Swinton Jacob is he was a public servant, he was an engineer, who was also, I guess, sort of architecturally minded. And in his long career, he did a lot of very interesting, very useful public service designs, including dams and waterways and so on. He addressed the challenging water issues in India head on. But at the same time, he became so enamored of the traditional architecture that he sent out a large team of Indian draftsmen before photography to go and measure and draw up a compendium of traditional Indian details, partly just to preserve them for the future, and then also to be able to use them in a kind of compendium book, which is the way Victorian architects often worked. You remember the Victorian era was related to the Industrial Revolution, and so there were kits of parts that Victorian architects used that were often prefabricated metal elements like porches and roofs and decorative elements and so on. And so he ended up producing an enormous compendium, which is still available today, of these. It was called the Jaipur Portfolio of Architectural Details. And if anyone is particularly interested in it, it's still available in 6 volumes today. And so because of that, he actually had access to some very good drawings of original details. So he wasn't looking at copies. He was actually using original details from fine old buildings as part of the kit of parts he referred to. So I actually think that the detailing is really quite good. I think the composition is better here. So amongst the practitioners, I think he was really one of the more skilled and the ones he'd done the most work to become well educated in the genre. And I think it shows in his own buildings. Thank you.
So This is an interesting building of, again, from Swinton Jacob. And I think to some extent, it shows very important, I think, one important consideration that these practitioners of Indo-Saracenic had. And this was actually, it was often expressed in so many words that that if you this was an architecture that was practiced in order to involve more Indian craftsmen into the process of the making of new buildings. Of course, you were creating buildings that were very modern, but one way in which you could involve the traditional craftsman was in this kind of surface ornamentation, and obviously because it was only by following I think it was Chisholm who talked about art language. The art language of the Indian craftsmen is something that they have inherently, and they are the ones who are going to carve these stones. They are the ones who are going to mold this plaster or whatever you were going to do. And therefore, it made sense for the overwhelmingly British practitioners of this architecture in India to use as the design vocabulary of the surface of these, which these craftsmen could also contribute to in their own way. So this is one example where there's a lot of surface ornamentation. You can't I don't know how much you can appreciate with this level of resolution on the screen, but this was one of those buildings which is quite intricately carved as well, and suitable for this kind of a building, which was a palace, again designed by Swinton Jacob. Any thoughts on this, Ankie?
Sure, I think you've made most of the great points. Yes, this was luckily a commission from a Maharaja. Maharaja Ganga Singh, who asked for a palace, and so being asked to design a palace meant that it was entirely appropriate to use these elements. I think to your point that you made earlier, he had these very skilled draftsmen, Indian draftsmen, working in his office, predominantly Indian draftsmen. And it seems quite possible, since he was really trained as an engineer, that once the massing of the building and the plans had been worked out, that he might well have turned over the rendering of the elevations and the development of the detail to his Indian draftsman, the same way he was suggesting Lutyens do with the Rashtrapati Bhavan, which Lutyens rejected. So I think it shows this building once again made of beautiful local stone and lasting very well, beautifully detailed. I think the proportions to my eye are quite good, and it shows probably the incorporation, as you say, of skilled Indian craftsmen and draftsmen applied over the massing and planning of the building, which Swinton Jacob was probably more directly involved in.
So
but it's now a hotel, so people can go and stay there. It's one of the heritage hotels. Well worth a stay. Yeah.
Right. And the range of these, I mean, the last few, we've been looking at some of the Rajasthan buildings, but of course, the range of buildings built all over India, it's quite wide. And so is the style. And something like this Muir College, Allahabad, which is now the Allahabad University in Allahabad, which is now called Prayagraj, by William Emerson. And it's an interesting building because it is quite different in style from the Rajput palaces that we've been seeing so far, because it actually, I mean, again, I will yield to the advice, the opinion of people better qualified to assess these, but it almost reminds me of the kind of single minaret mosques that you see in West Asia, etc. This is not an Indian style, with the dome and the prominent one minar. We tend to have styles where the mosque, the body of the mosque is quite big, and the minars tend to be symmetrical, so at least two, and slender. So it is interesting, and the choice for a university is even more interesting. What do you say about this, Ankie?
Well, you're very clever to use the word interesting because, of course, it leaves one up to one's own impressions as to what one thinks. But for me, this is a somewhat confused composition once again. I do like the use of the courtyard, which seems very appropriate for college, and it was an early college. I looked at the plan online and on Google Earth just to look at it, and it's interesting. The very tall tower, which is somewhat reminiscent of some of the early famous sort of minarets in India elsewhere, is very close to the dome of the central building, and it is quite off-center to the overall composition. So why he felt it was important to pile so many important compositional elements into one corner puzzles me a little bit. And when you look at the front facade, the pavilion on the left with the small or medium-sized dome is quite welcoming. The one in the middle is also welcoming, and there's the other arch on the right, and it's not clear where you would enter the building once again. And I think these are sort of part of the confusion. But as you say, the style reached far because this is in really quite far northwest in Uttar Pradesh, so it is a long way from where Swinton Jacob practiced most of the time. And it's also, one has to remember, this is a rather early example. I think perhaps as Swinton Jacob's book weren't even out at that point. His compendium wasn't published. And so I think this is William Emerson sort of doing his best on his own in the genre.
Right. And this is the last example I have of the Indo-Saracenic buildings. And I've been emphasizing the fact that this was a genre of architecture in which it was British architects who were the most prominent, but there were Indians as well. And Bhai Ram Singh is the one who's responsible for this one, HSN College in Lahore, which of course is a very well-known college for all of us in the subcontinent. We are very familiar with HSN College, but I think I will leave it to Ankie to analyze this building and tell us a little bit about Bhai Ram Singh.
Thank you. I have to say, I do admire this building, and Bhai Ram Singh is a very interesting fellow, very talented. At an early age, his skill was noticed, and he was introduced to and sort of apprenticed to Lockwood Kipling, who was Rudyard Kipling's father, who was born in England but spent most of his career in India. And he was a very prominent fellow, and he ended up being a professor of architecture. And so he was around skilled and educated people early on. And I think the use of the materials and the details is quite judicious. I do like the balance of the building. This building is, of course, now in what is Pakistan, and it is sort of the jewel of this university. It's a very highly regarded university. I also think it's worth noting that the clock is very quietly added to the lower part of the central dome in a way that doesn't really detract from the composition at all. This is clearly the main axis of entry, but the wing extends quite far to the right in a very pleasant manner. The slightly enlarged chhatri on the right, I think, is a rather successful Victorian compositional gesture to let you know that it's clearly not a bilaterally symmetrical building. I also think that he uses the jali, the carved Indian screens, which were very often used to offer a safe place for women to be able to look down on the goings-on, particularly women of high order, to see the goings-on in palaces or meetings and so on. And it was used just as a decorative element very often by many of the English architects. But here he doesn't use it, I think, too much. And I think in the arcade that you see on the right with the tall, rather interesting crisscrosses and the elements of jali, of course, in this very hot climate and with lots of driving rain, it's a very good way in which to temper the climate, allow the breezes in, keep you dry, give you some filtered shade and so on. So I find this, again, a successful building. And once again, it's built out of, traditional solid stone, and they clearly maintain it. I think it's a fine building, and his skill was recognized at the highest order during his life. He ended up working in England on a few important projects, including Queen Victoria's summer house on the islands where she would go bathing in the Isle of Wight. And he actually worked on some of the buildings there. So he was very, very highly regarded in his life, and his skill was evident, I think, as you can see in this building. So it's very nice to see the hand of a skilled Indian practitioner in this realm, and really one of the more successful buildings, I think, of the genre.
Thank you so much. So I think it was useful to have this slightly a little bite of what Indo-Saracenic really signified, what it was. What was it that Lutyens was being called upon to engage with in some way or the other. But I must say that his main client on the Delhi project, which was the Viceroy, Harding, um, uh, should be credited for not having, though he did say that Swinton Jacob should be engaged on the with this team. He should be a consultant on this team. He did suggest that both Lutyens and Baker should go and look at actual Indian buildings rather than be given either. And they were given books on the history of Indian architecture. And of course, they got a lot of the Chhajja and Chhatri and the kind of stock motifs of the Indo-Saracenic style. And so they did go and look at actual Indian buildings. And I just wanted to put one in here I used it to, I was thinking of just using it to illustrate some of the features that they were being asked to incorporate in their buildings. And this is the Diwan-e-Khas in the Red Fort in Delhi. Built in the mid-17th century, really the high point of Mughal architecture under Shah Jahan. This is just after the this was built just as the Taj Mahal was nearing completion, in fact. And you can see some of the prominent features which became a stock of Indo-Saracenic style. The Chhatri, which you can see highlighted here, which was often put on top of as a prominent feature on top of parapets. This is a flat-roofed building, of course, but for domed buildings, these would again cluster around the dome. And you have the Chhajja. This is this long eave that you see running around the building, a broad stone piece which protects the building against driving rain or direct sun, though often this, in a building like this, it would have been supplemented with a broad awning in the summer months. So, and of course, you can see the scalloped arches, which you saw in the Mayo College building as well. So these are the kind of features that were there. But Lutyens, of course, saw them in Indo-Saracenic buildings, and then he went and saw them in a building like this, which is a Mughal building. And I would be interested to know what Ankie thinks of an Indo-Saracenic building as opposed to seeing these features in a Mughal building, Chhatri, Chhajjas, these kind of arches.
Thank you, Swapna. I do think it was very important that Harding, as you say, suggested that and facilitated that Lutyens and Baker do fairly extensive tour looking at original buildings, because rather than the pastiches or the interpretations of others. And I have to say, from some of the buildings I've seen in Calcutta or elsewhere by earlier practitioners, they really were more confused. And so they probably invited even more derision than Lutyens and Baker might have, as kind of imperial architects might have thought about some of Indian history anyway. What I like about this building is the repose and the simplicity and the confidence. The skyline or the profile of the building against the sky is extremely simple. And the Chhatri, of course, mark the points and give it just a little bit of interest and a little bit of lightness. The building might seem to be a little heavy without them. And when we look at Lutyens' composition for the Rashtrapati Bhavan, and you have some good slides to follow, I think that the punctuation of the skyline with Chhatri is really a significant contribution to the success of that very, very large building in the wings, rather than the dome at the center. The other thing that you said, I do think this beautiful shade provided by this big overhang, the Shahjas, is something that Lutyens used to great effect. I mean, it really is similar to a cornice in classical architecture that has decorative elements and shadow. This, in a more successful way, certainly in India for the climate, creates that shadow and that punctuation of the top of the main elevation of the building before you get to the roofscape. And I think it's important, as you pointed out, in India, during festivals or the use of these buildings, you can see the little metal hooks just under the shade line of this building. And there were very often these beautiful awnings, colorful, with poles that actually provided more shade and more accommodation outside of the building, because usually it was only the royal family or the Maharaja or the king who would have been seated in this audience hall. And so other nobles or ordinary people who were coming around would also have some shade and shelter. So these buildings are actually, when you do rarely see them with the awnings added on, actually have a lightness to them. And it was a fundamental component of this architecture that you don't see in just the marble building. Anyway, it's a great example. Thank you.
I was struck by the lightness of the true Indian buildings compared to the heaviness and the massing of the Indo-Saracenic British design buildings. This has an ethereal quality that almost floats above the pavilion that they're anchored on. So they're just beautiful.
One last
Yes.
point I'd like to make. There's always a base that elevates the important people, etc., above the ground, above the people, improves the sightline, is recognition of their elevated status. And this is something that the Indo-Saracenic style doesn't often recognize in the public buildings, but it's something that Lutyens took note of, and it's a very strong contribution to the success of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Sorry, you were going to say something else, Swapna.
No, that's a very important statement, I think. That's a very important thing to note. Also, just to point out, of course, that if you look at a building like the Diwan-e Khas in the Red Fort, it's fundamentally a Mughal building in the typical pavilion style. This is not something that could be, as it was, be adapted to colonial records office or even a museum, for instance. So the functions, the cultural context, all of that, of course, is very important, but probably outside the scope of a lot of the discussion here. But coming now to Lutyens and what Lutyens did with this. He designed, and all the, I'm going to take very few examples, and I'm going to take the examples from Viceroy's house, which we now call Rashtrapati Bhavan, where the Indian president stays. So this is overall, you must have seen this before, you may be familiar with this. And if we look at the next slide, we get a closer look, for instance, at what Lutyens does with the chhatris. And there are two distinct kinds of chhatris here. One at the base of the big dome and on the parapet towards the right, two little chhatris on the parapet on the right. Now, as I said, that Lutyens had been asked, both Lutyens and Baker, in fact, had been sent off to visit several places in central India, in North India, to look at Indian architecture. And they looked at Indian architecture from the 14th century onwards. In fact, even ancient Indian architecture they saw. They saw a lot of different kinds of buildings. And one of them was this building, which is the 17th century palace in Datia. It's on a hill and it's quite spectacular in its setting, of course. And this is one of the buildings that Lutyens actually admired quite a bit. And if we see how Lutyens might have approached this from the village itself, this is the building. And this would have been, this photograph was taken in 1928. So just a few years after Lutyens would have visited it, and he would have climbed up or been taken up in a carriage or something up the hill to this building. And you can see all the houses and all of the village below that. And so what did Lutyens do in how he incorporated some of these things? I'm going to take a few examples of this and say how Lutyens incorporated some of these features into his buildings. And if you look at what he did with the chhatris, the next, yes, thank you, Robin. So if on the right you see a Rashtrapati Bhavan chhatri. You can see the chhatri on the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the parapet, and It's always, I mean, it's always interesting to see how this chhatri is designed, because it's almost pushed down. Instead of the typical chhatri is on little pillars standing up as an umbrella, as the name suggests. But this one is kind of almost pushed down into the parapet. It's sits much lower on the parapet. But it's really interesting to see that there was a very close parallel of this kind of chhatri in the Datia Palace. And if you look at the picture on the left, I'm sorry, it's not very clear. I mean, it's a small picture. I could not get a bigger picture for this. But if you can see on the extreme left of that photograph, you can see a chhatri which is similarly pushed down into the parapet and with a little jali decorative element added to it as well. And as well as the rather high dome of that, like a narrow, somewhat, elongated dome of the chhatri, which is also, in fact, a feature of Lutyens' chhatri. You can't see it because of the angle of the photograph. I took this photograph from the ground level, and that is, of course, quite low. So therefore, you can't see the actual height of the dome there. But a very similar kind of chhatri that he used. If you look at this building, this is one of the buildings, again, which one of the sites that Lutyens had visited, which is in Mandu in central India. And this was a 15th century tomb. And it's quite spectacular in its stark white marble surface decoration. And if you look at you can see that the chhajja is broken, but it had a deep chhajja. What is interesting about this building and somewhat unusual is that the chhatris, first of all, are pretty solid. They are not on those little spindly pillars that you often see chhatris on. They are quite solid. The drums, it's just like the shape is really very much chhatri, but these are like supplementary domes that are attached to the drum itself. And they cluster very close to the main dome, on the four corners of the main dome. And if you look at the dome of Viceroy's house, Rashtrapati Bhavan, you will see what he did. He used these four chhatris, clustered them very close to the dome. If you'll go back, Robin, to the earlier picture of the dome, where you can see the one before this, where you see Rashtrapati, or sorry, even before that. I'm sorry to make you do this, but if you could just have a look at the earlier dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan, where the chhatris are like really kind of, you can see them, sticking out from the. Yes, here. Sorry, this was all this far back. But you can see how these chhatris below the dome, the drum has this big striped pattern, and below that is this other four chhatris. You can see two of them here from this view, how they are attached very close to the dome. Though, of course, they have that, it's slightly different. It's not completely solid. There's that empty, that's that space there, which provides this very interesting element of shade below that solid drum, and kind of breaks that up very interestingly between the two colors of the stone, the red and the beige. But you can see the two chhatris there. And I wanted to point that out because when you come down to this view of it, you can almost not, you can see the chhatris almost disappearing from view here. And at one point, this is a somewhat facetious comment, but Lutyens had said in one letter, he was very frustrated by, as I said, Swinton Jacob bringing him chhatris to put on his buildings. And he said, chhatris are stupid, useless things. And you can almost see that he wants these chhatris to at least sometimes disappear from view or be a little less conspicuous. But yes, so that is the chhatri over here. Also, when we are looking at this dome, one thing that we always are always reminded of is another example of ancient Indian architecture that Lutyens had actually admired quite a lot, which was the Sanchi stupa, particularly this railing. He liked this railing. He mentioned this, that this railing of an ancient Buddhist site, that he really admired this. He used this not only as a motif in the drum of the Sanchi stupa, but also as a enclosing railing in what is known as the Great Place, or today called Vijay Chowk in Delhi. It's just below the Secretariat buildings, just below the hill. It's a large open area, and it is enclosed by red sandstone railings with this pattern. I'm sorry, I didn't have a good a picture of that to really bring that out nicely. But this was another one of those buildings that he went there, and he went beyond, as I said, the Indo-Saracenic to go and look to see what there was in Indian architecture to try and find appropriate things. Another thing from the palace in Datia that he used, we all noticed that Lutyens' Chhatris have these really deep chhajjas. They have these really deep chhajjas, and this Datia palace of the 17th century, this was the kind of deep chhajja that this had as well. And of course, Lutyens uses this in Rashtrapati Bhavan. If you look at, say, the next picture, where you have one of the chhatris. This is as you approach. I took this picture as you approach from the south side. If you approach the forecourt, or in fact the area where the Jaipur column is placed, and you see the big elephant carrying the weight of that chhatri on its back. And it's an interesting on the one hand, you had this idea of elephants that could easily be used as to Indianize a building. When in doubt, use elephants is something that Lutyens was not the first to have done something like that. But there was an interesting precedent as well. And I'm sorry, I don't have a photograph right now, but I might have shared this in an earlier webinar as well, that in front of the Red Fort, you have these two massive elephants that Shah Jahan had installed as an entrance motif for his fort. So this had that kind of precedent there. And of course, the massive pillars that you can see those soldiers standing under. And these were, we were having this conversation earlier, and Ankie had pointed out that these, could be seen as those massive legs of the elephants. The elephant is an animal that Lutyens absolutely loved, and there are these wonderful sketches he made of elephants. He referred to them often, and you can definitely see that happening. And of course, South Indian temples sometimes have these kind of big, massive pillars supporting the huge halls that those old temples have. So you have some examples of these from Indian architecture as well. One thing that he did, which was very clever, which is the chhajja. And the chhajja is a really deep chhajja. It is quite imposing. It gives that whole facade of this big building kind of unity that is quite lovely. But one thing that I noticed was that he's done this very clever thing with the underside of the chhajja. He has put a pattern there which will be quite recognizable to anybody who is familiar with Delhi's historic architecture. If you're familiar with Mughal and Sultanate buildings, you will recognize this kind of pattern, which is called the Kangura pattern. And this Kangura pattern, you can see running around this Peshtak frame in a very important building of Delhi, which is the 16th century Humayun's tomb. You can see this pattern, and Lutyens didn't want to put this on the as this kind of panel, which somebody else might have done, but he included it in the underside of the Chajja, which I quite like that touch that he puts. And then there are some things that he used, which were, there are, as I said, there are very few things that he just uses as is, but he uses this. It's a jali from the Red Fort, and it is in a building which is known as the Khas Mahal. And this was a very important building. This is where the Mughal emperor used to sit below this, in front of this screen, and where he interacted with his most trusted ministers, etc. And this is something that Lutyens took, and he included in this is the southern court of Viceroy's house, where he uses this particular motif. On the last few slides, do you have some comment, Ankie, to make on these?
Yes, thank you. I think you've covered almost everything that's of value, but I think I'll just point out a couple of things. Here you can see the use of the red sandstone, which was also the natural color of the Racina Hill, on which the important government buildings, the secretariats by Baker and the Viceroy's house by Lutyens, are located. And they chose it because they were looking for an Acropolis-like hill. So, of course, being classicists and looking for, let's say, citing advantages from previous sort of important imperial cities, they thought about the Acropolis in Rome. Lutyens also referred to the dome from the Pantheon as his main inspiration, although you can see he's got this beautiful detail from the stupa in it. I do think the use of the base, the red sandstone base at the bottom of the building, and the main stairs that lead you up to the important rooms, which are the piano nobile, of course, very traditional in classical architecture, that all the important floors would be one floor above the ground. And then once again, he switches to the red sandstone as the base for the tower itself. If you can go back one slide, Robin, I'll point out this I'm particularly fond of Jali, and this one is so interesting that you pointed out, and it's very sensitive and I think very attractive. The change in the thickness of the stone shows enormous skill in the carving. You know, most Jali are rather like this one that I'm holding here. I don't know if you can see it, a sort of very even geometric pattern of sort of pretty consistent thickness and therefore strength. The skill to be able to carve this element and not have it fall apart is extraordinary. If you go back another one, sorry.
We need to wind up so we can have some questions.
That's fine. Let's do questions.
I just want to say that this is not a dated building. There's a timelessness about it that is not there in the more Indo-Saracenic buildings that were done in the Victorian style. So I'm going to turn this over to some questions from our audience. Thank you, guys. You both did a wonderful, wonderful job.
Yeah, great job. Marcus here. Actually, we don't have any open questions right now that I can see. So I'm not sure.
Then can I ask you to run back a couple of slides, Robin? There's just one more thing I wanted to say, sort of in conclusion, about the Viceroy's house, the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Is it hard for you to share again?
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Okay. If you go back another one, if you would. And another one. Just perfect. I think that if you look at this example, you can see that really the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the Viceroy's house, is really a strict and elegant neoclassical building. If you look at the classical elements, I mean, almost everything is classical except for the overhang, except that the Chhaja, which he's got, is very skillfully hidden, but important decorative element. You notice there's no normal cornice at all above the columns or above the building at all, but in fact, he embraces this beautiful Indian overhang as his cornice for the building. And the shadow, when you're far away in the strong Indian sun, is extraordinary. And then, of course, there's the little chhatri at the top, which helps define this otherwise possibly severe skyline of this very, very long building. So I think this is a wonderful slide that illustrates how Lutyens, I think better than most, if not all, of the Indo-Saracen practitioners, incorporated just a few extraordinarily powerful Indian elements in a most successful way, in which is largely a neoclassical building, to sort of make his point about the English imperial presence in India.
Nice.
Thank you.
Well, Thank you, Ankie. We actually did have one question that just came in, which is from Rodney Whitaker. Are there any examples of Indo-Saracenic architecture in the UK?
I'm sorry. I think there are.
Is the Brighton Pavilion? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would qualify, I think.
And if one goes to see Victoria's country house on the Isle of Wight, there you can see the work of Mr. Singh, the Indian architect that we saw earlier. There are a few examples. If you look them up online, there are a couple of other palaces that have rooms in the Indo-Saracen style. If you look online, you can see references.
And somebody says also Sezin coat in the Cotswolds. Sezin coat.
Says Season Court House. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So unfortunately,
that's an early example, I think.
Right. Well, that's another webinar right there. And Chisholm's in Cadogan Hall. So maybe we've got another webinar coming up there. So we'll explore that more fully. But I'm not sure how it would relate back to Lutyens in such a fine way that we've done here. So I just wanted to kind of round this off and say thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure to share this time together. If you've enjoyed the conversation and would like to stay connected, we warmly invite you to become a member of our trusts. Membership is a wonderful way to support the preservation and appreciation of Lutyens' work, while also joining a vibrant community of enthusiasts, scholars, and friends. And you can learn more and join at LutyensTrustAmerica.com in the US and LutyensTrust.org.uk in the UK. And we'd love to continue the journey with you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you, Swapna and Ankie, for such an incredible webinar. And thank you, Robin, also for co-hosting this. Thank you very much.